Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to another episode of Spliced In Later. I hope you all have been keeping well in the time that I have been gone, and I hope you enjoyed the many episodes that I dropped as compensation for not being around the week before. It's been a busy one, but we're back and we're raring to go. And for today, we are going to go back to our regularly scheduled program of the continuous series of shows that we've been doing on here for quite some time, basically for some consistent content. And one of my more popular and one of my more favorite things that we've been doing since almost a year ago we started is we have been going through the Disney animated classic films and breaking them down into the well-known ages that each of these films are located in, and basically just getting an understanding of what that time period was like for Disney releasing these films, how this stuff influenced the content that they released, whether they were critically acclaimed, the animation style, the highs, the lows, basically the turbulence and the everything else that goes with these ages. Because Disney has not always been the unstoppable railroad of success that it is now. In many cases, it has clung on to itself by the seat of its pants, depending on what's going on in the world around it, going on box office money returns, taking risks, taking chances. They've had very, very high highs, but especially during the period we're about to address here, they've also had some low lows. Before I get into it, though, I do want to give everyone a reminder, if this is the first episode they're tuning into and they haven't checked out any of the others, they should do. We have already done 5 episodes before this one here. So we've gone through a few ages already. We started off with the golden era of Disney, which was basically the birth of feature-length animation, well, also dubbed as Walt's Folly in the beginning, where Walt Disney and the Disney company strive to try and create an animated feature that wasn't just a short or something that was in front of another movie or just used for kids, but using animation to tell a feature-length story, taking advantage of the many fairy tales and magical stories that were out there. These 5 films in the golden era, Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi, what are considered the golden age of Disney. They shocked everyone with their ability to use animation to tell a story, gripping characters, voice, directing, animation. The magic of what is Disney was essentially on screen. They may not have made hundreds and hundreds of dollars, especially during World War II, but this was the beginning point for Disney. We then looked at the wartime era, which basically was just Disney attempting to keep the lights on while everybody was off fighting World War II, taking pretty much projects that they had been working on, turning them into anthology movies, doing a bit of showcase for stuff that they had been working on but couldn't finish. Not the usual animated features that they had strived to begin with in the golden age, but just stuff to keep people happy as well during a very turbulent time, and also to keep the lights on and money, however small it may be, in the pockets of Disney to keep it going. So that eventually, once the war was over and the Silver Age began, we jumped into the true magic of Disney that inspired basically Disneyland in terms of going into fairy tale stories, talking animals, stuff like that, really taking advantage of the evolvingness of animation, using color, using spectacle, all of that stuff. We then looked at the Bronze Age, which is where Disney sort of fell into a bit of a hole, not in terms of trying to tell good stories, but just in terms of cost cutting, looking into cheaper ways to produce animation at a quicker rate, thereby sacrificing the overall quality of the picture. Some would say laziness in reusing animation, the stories weren't exactly as magical as Disney had done, but also some quality cult classics in there. And then we got, which I believe is the pinnacle of Disney, and I'm sure everybody would agree, we talked about the Renaissance, which is the resurgence of Disney in the 90s, where they just made film after film that was not only critically acclaimed, but made a ton of money. The animation was just getting better and better. The effort that they put in, the protagonists, the storylines, the vibrant over-the-top villains, the memorability of these films, which basically got to the point where we are here. That success of the Renaissance led into... Okay, it's hard to... People have different words for this age. Some call it the post-Renaissance age, which I will try and go by for this one, as I think it's the kindest and the most accurate term for it. But some other people call it the second dark age. or just the Dark Age if they don't think that the Bronze Age was the Dark Era for Disney. Some call it the Experimental Era, which is interesting, but I suppose, yeah, that could be relevant. But to be nice and kind, we're going to call it the Post-Renaissance Age. Now, as I said, the Post-Renaissance Era, people look at it and they tend to give this era a bit of a bad rep or shit on some of these movies. Some deservedly so, some not so much. But it seems to be that the general consensus is that between the Renaissance Age and the last age, what we will talk about eventually, called the Revival Era, which is still going on right now apparently, there was this point in the 2000s where Disney didn't really know what it wanted to do. It tried to stray away from the formula of the Renaissance films that had been so successful. Some say they got a little bit too cocky with themselves and their ability to produce quality content, that they overlooked actually the essence of trying and just made these movies going, we are Disney, people will pay money and like them regardless of what we do. There's also a bit of a panic as to what was going on around them. Other animation studios were starting to make their footprint in the world. There was a lot going on which made the fact that this era was not easy to describe. As I've said with the other ages, you can discern what it is about them that defines that era. If it's the Renaissance era, it's the fairy tale protagonist of a strong, independent warrior, mostly female princess, but sometimes anything else from a variety of different eras and time periods, whether it's the Greek gods, under the sea, China, all of that stuff. But it'll always be one particular standout character that the movie is based around, and they have to overcome challenges and being put upon and defeat a very vibrant, over-the-top, wacky, memorable villain with some wisecracking sidekicks along the way, and of course, many, many musical numbers, which remain to this day to be some of the most memorable Disney songs of all time. If you go back to the Silver Age, it's defined as the Disney Princess era, the fairy tales, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Sleeping Beauty. Combine that with the talking animals in the modern day setting, 101 Dalmatians, for example. For the post-Renaissance era, it's hard. There's very different films. Animation itself changed, and there was no going back from it based on the resurgence, not the resurgence, but the beginning of computer animation, pulling away from the standard 2D animation. The riskiness of Disney trying to take on different themes and tones that they had not addressed before, science fiction, adventure, that the evolving nature of humor as well for the 21st century. So it's a turbulent time. As I've said, for example, with the MCU, for the most part, as they go forward, they plan out what they want to do with their films very far in advance. So you can see that path that the MCU films have taken. You can see they've strayed to a particular endgame scenario. For the post-Renaissance era, no. The movies themselves changed drastically depending on how successful the movie had been before it, what they were competing against in terms of other animation departments, and overall plans for what they were going to do to keep Disney relevant and ready for the 21st century. Before we get into it, though, it is important to note, as you are a familiar listener to this show, you probably already know this, but I'm in the minority when it comes to some of these films in the post-Renaissance era. In fact, when I made my top 10 films, my top 10 Disney animated classics, there were a few films in this era that I put on my top 10 or gave an honorable mention. And that's because, again, I'm in the minority here, but I like a lot of the stories that they've told in this era, and I like some of the risks that they took. As great as the Renaissance era is, you cannot do the same thing over and over again. And some of the stories that they tell in this era, I really like in terms of the themes, the messages, the darker storytelling they were going for. Probably a reflection as well for me growing up. Around this time I was getting older. I was looking for more out of my films than just the standard sing-along musical adventure story that you get from the Renaissance era. That's not to say I like all of them. There are some in here that are trash, but I don't think they're trash by design. I think you can see a lot of panic and behind-the-scenes fiasco going on with those films, which we will get into, which influenced their overall product. If Disney had been more confident in their ability to create these films, if they had stuck to their original plans, perhaps the films would have been better. But the other films in here, sometimes they get a bit of shit because they're not musicals. They don't have the usual formula for Disney of song after song after song, or protagonist in a fantastical setting that has to go up against a wacky villain. Some are just simple adventure stories set in space. set under the water, set in the jungle, set in the far-off ancient Incas, stuff like that. Very few songs in them. Some take the Tarzan approach of hiring an actor to sing songs in the background, but the characters themselves are not singing. But the story they tell is great. I love it. And the animation is still great. I do miss 2D animation. I know we won't get much of it in the future going forward, but I do think that there's something about it which is timeless. And I think too many animation companies are so focused on just doing the same 3D animation, computer-generated animation as well, over and over again, because that's just the way animation is these days. So yeah, basically, if you've clicked on this episode because you've seen it's the post-Renaissance films and you're expecting me to shit on all of them, that's not going to happen. You will find me to be very positive for quite a few of them, saying they are misunderstood gems that need better understanding and better looks into. So just be prepared for that. There will be, of course, a couple, though, that are just not good, no matter how well you look at them, but we'll get into that. If you want more information about what it is about made the post-Renaissance era so turbulent, pretty much it starts off strong. We go into 2D animation as per normal after the very, very high points of Tarzan, Mulan, The Lion King, Aladdin. Even less critically successful Pocahontas and Hercules still made a ton of money. So Disney was very sure of itself when it started this period with its animation showcase and the stories that it went into, focusing mainly on the 2D stories. But around them, things were changing. And that we can sum that up specifically with a little movie called Shrek. DreamWorks burst onto the scene in 2000 with its CG animated film Shrek, after also doing several very good 2D animation films in the past, not to near to the same success as Disney, but still relatively good stuff. But Shrek was this little movie that blew everybody out of the water, not just in terms of its step forward in CG animation, but its unique spin on the classic fairy tale trope that Disneyland had been doing over and over again, taking animation humor and stepping it up for 21st century, changing the way people make jokes and people look at animation and people tell stories. And when people saw stuff like that in Shrek, they wanted more of it. Disney on the left side was still doing the same sort of stuff with their 2D animation, which reflected in terms of the critical success of Shrek to its films that were coming out at Disney at the other time. To respond to this, Disney, of course, went, all right, cool, we'll do CG animation as well. But they didn't think it through, in my opinion. The movies that were CG in the beginning, the CG does not look well. I do not think that the Disney actors, the artists that they hired to take on these movies perhaps were ready for this new turn. I don't know if they got the 2D animators to work on 3D, or whoever they hired just wasn't good at it. But it's very noticeable in those movies. There's a gruffness to it and an unease sense of it that really shines through, of an insecure insincerity to these films, which makes looking back on the Disney animated classics and seeing those films scattered about, and it really takes away the timelessness of such a long run of great films. And there it was. There was so much going on with that. DreamWorks was then pumping out Shrek sequels, Madagascar, Kung Fu Panda, really cementing itself as the DreamWorks CG animation, and getting, whether they were all critically acclaimed or not, irrelevant. They were making bank. They were making money. Ice Age was coming along as well, out the side there for 20th Century Fox. So Disney held on for a bit longer with a few 2D animations, but tried to mix things up, going more into sci-fi territory, pulling back on the musicals, trying to make the plots and stories a bit more unique, like Shrek. When that wasn't working for them, they then, of course, jumped into full-time CG, was, as I said, the first few results, messy, insecure with their ability to be confident in their ability to make a movie. With the last couple of movies that came out in this era, you can see Disney getting a bit more confident in its ability to embrace this new animation and to embrace movies that aren't necessarily big musical numbers, but also aren't necessarily completely out there with the plans and stories that they were doing, just tweaking things ever slightly. There is a debate on what I'm going to include as the last movie of the post-Renaissance era. I'm going to include it with a 2008 film. Some people say the 2009 film, which I will mention in my next episode, should be in this age. I disagree, for a number of reasons. The first being that it doesn't fit in terms of the style, animation, critical success that these other films have. It's a different matter entirely, and I think it showcases not a step backward for Disney, as some would say, as it is the revert back to 2D animation style very briefly, but also a level of confidence and a level of powerful storytelling that Disney does not have present in this era. And I believe it launched the revival era. But we'll get into that when we do that episode. Let's not focus too much on that. Just a little housekeeping there for you if you expect me to end this episode on that movie and I don't mention it, because it will be in the next episode. All right, we'll go through as we normally do. We go through the movies of this era one by one. I'll tell you if I like them or not. I'll say whether they were good or not. We won't focus too much on them all because we'll be here all day. But just to give you an idea, if you're wondering what movies came out in the post-Renaissance era, what actually is he talking about? Well, here they are, one at a time. First, we have Fantasia 2000 in 1999, a real pat-on-your-back showcase that I think Disney attempted to do after having so much success with the Renaissance films, and because Fantasia from 1940 is so belovedly respected as a showcase of animation and style. Disney may have miscalculated in terms of, oh yeah, people are looking for another Fantasia. Let's take Walt's original plan of Fantasia being an always evolving, changing film with different pieces to reflect the changing animation style and move on with that, but also sort of do it like a, oh boy, isn't Disney great? Look at what we do. As such, it comes across as a pale comparison compared to the original Fantasia. The original Fantasia is just a 2-hour showcase of a variety of different sketches, and it's not, look at us, look how cool we are, look what we're doing. It's just saying, here's animation, here's some stuff we're trying. Do you think it's any good? Let us know. Fantasia 2000, with its celebrity stars, Steve Martin and James L. Jones and Bette Midler, Angela Lansbury, they all stand around patting themselves on the back going, here we go. Here's something else we've made from good old Disney. You love Disney, don't we? The ironic sense of it all as well is that the idea that it's a showcase of current animation, when Shrek would come out a year later and show how animation completely differed to what they were showing up in Fantasia 2000, just sort of shows of how unaware at the time Disney was of where animation was going, I think. That being said, Fantasia 2000 is still a fun watch. It is a variety of 6 shorts. As someone who enjoys the first Fantasia but has trouble finding the 2 hours to sit and watch it, this is a solid 70 minutes, so you get the point of it a much bit easier than the original Fantasia. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is in here, the most classic Mickey cartoon. It's fun enough. I just think you can tell watching it. It's like, okay, Disney, calm down. You're not that great. Move on to Dinosaur in 2000. Dinosaur is a unique film as it does attempt the CG animation, but takes it one step further by supplanting it onto a live-action background. So it's real landscape shots that you are looking at with CG dinosaurs planted on it to give it a real life look. The animation isn't great. Obviously, these are very early days of CG, and looking at it now, it hasn't aged particularly well. I have a soft spot for Dinosaur, I think because I had my very first trip to Disneyland in 2000. So as Dinosaur was the new movie at the time, Dinosaur was everywhere. Books, t-shirts, advertising, free screenings. People were marveling over this film. And as a kid, you're like, dinosaurs, that's cool. I like The Land Before Time. I like dinosaurs in general, so I'm happy to see the film. Rewatching it, looking at it now, it's a fairly boring film. It takes a long time to get going and you're not exactly sure what the point is. It works a very fine line as well, being for kids or being too dark for kids. But it is risky and it is experimental, and I like that. This would have been better used for something in Fantasia 2000, showing off that CG animation in like a little showcase instead of a full-length feature film. That said, Dinosaur's worth looking at if you haven't seen it. It does get a bit of a bad rap, in my opinion. 2001? Was it 2001? Who cares? The Emperor's New Groove. Actually, it probably was 2000 as well. Anyway, The Emperor's New Groove made my top 10 films of Disney. If you have seen that episode, again, check that out. I love the comedy of it. I love the wackiness of David Spade as Cusco and John Goodman as Parcher, and especially Eartha Kitt as Yzma and Patrick Warburton as Kronk. It is a very fun adventure story with no songs, apart from an Tom Jones thing at the start. But otherwise, it is a very 21st century style humor film with 2D animation. This was the first time where Disney went, okay, we're pulling away from the musical stuff. We're going to try something different. And I think Emperor's New Groove has probably got the best reception out of the 2D animations that came in the post-Renaissance era. I think because it is just impossible not to like it. It is funny, it is silly, it is groovy. It's definitely a lot of fun. In 2001, Atlantis, The Lost Empire, again, one of my top 10 films. I think Atlantis as well has recently had more of a respect given to it. I've seen many people online, though, that just shit all over this film and just say it's so boring and uneventful and doesn't belong in a Disney film. I think it's great. It's a great tribute to that pulp adventure style like Indiana Jones. Milo Thatch, voiced by Michael J. Fox, is one of my favorite protagonists. I love those movie scenarios where a guy gets together with a group and he's the insignificant one. He's got to prove himself. You get a wide variety of wacky characters: Vinny, the Mole, Dr. Sweet, Audrey, and then the ink science of, or magic, or whatever it is that makes Atlantis, the animation of the blue lights and everything going on there, look incredible. And it gets very dark in certain places too. But I really liked that. And I think Atlantis, I mean, I said all I need to say about Atlantis in that top 10, but it was a great film. Moving on, we had Lilo and Stitch. Okay, Lilo and Stitch, fantastic, because Stitch is impossible to not like. Even when he's talking in his funny voice, if you don't like his funny voice, you have no soul. Lilo and Stitch is very sweet, full of heart, and it's unique for Disney for straying into that sci-fi era. Again, I think Lilo and Stitch was better received in the old days, mainly because Stitch is cute, so kids are going to like Stitch, but he's also so bizarre and over the top that adults, would find him funny too. A great film for sure. And my number 2 film from my top 10 Disney films was Treasure Planet. Again, I think people are discovering now how great Treasure Planet was. A spin on the Treasure Island story with Jim Hawkins in space looking for the fabled Treasure Planet instead of Treasure Island, of course, and his relationship with the anti-hero Long John Silver. It's a great adventure story. I like it. These last 4 films that I've mentioned, this is the stuff that I think people struggle with. They're adventure style stories that stray into the dark, very little music in them. It is a more straightforward adventure stories with comedy thrown in. But I think people need to appreciate that for what they are, because Disney recently, I think this year we had Raya and the Last Dragon, that did not have any songs in it at all, and that was an adventure style movie. So it's hard for me to hear people go to Raya and go, that's great, that's classic Disney, when the exact same style was in both Atlantis and Treasure Planet. So food for thought on that one. Of course, there's also Brother Bear too. Brother Bear I love. Brother Bear is sweet. Brother Bear followed the formula of Tarzan of getting Phil Collins to sing the story. It is a truly, in fact, it's probably the last 2D animation film before the revival era that really showcased Disney's very, very, very strong ability to use 2D animation for bright lights and colors and magic in terms of humans being changed into bears and the Aurora Borealis and all that. It's a sweet little story of a man who learns to be a better person by becoming a bear. It's sweet. It's got Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas as the Canadian comedy duo, transplanted into Moose, Ruttentook, however you say their names. Brother Bear, again, another classic that I think doesn't get the recognition that it deserves. From here onwards, this is where things got really turbulent though. We have Home on the Range in 2005. Home on the Range not only doesn't take advantage of using animation really well to tell a story, but the story itself is just not great. I really struggle rewatching Home on the Range. I get the point, I get the message, but the story of the cows going off on an adventure, the yodeling Randy Quaid, all of that, it's grating to me, and it doesn't work for me. And I think it didn't work for a lot of people too, because this was the death bell for 2D animation for Disney for quite some time, until a fluke revival a few years later. Then there's Chicken Little. Chicken Little is what I mentioned earlier, the example of making a CG film just because, okay, that's the way the wind's blowing, animation needs to be done, we need to make Chicken Little. We haven't honed our skills since Dinosaur by any means, but we're going to make a movie, and we're going to make it about a generic story, a fable, if you will, a 4-line fairy fable, and turn it into an hour-and-a-half film with annoying characters, very, very basic, unthought-out plot, not even impressive voice acting itself. Chicken Little is hard to look at with your eyes as well. It's boring as well. It's hard to really find, I don't know. From what I could see on Instagram when I did mention Chicken Little, there may be 1 or 2 people out there who love this film with a passion. I am not one of them. Disney found its footing Bit better with its next film, Meet the Robinsons. The CG looks so much better. It is a very interesting story that starts in the present and then travels to the future. Takes advantage of the CG animation to imagine a Tomorrowland, the world of the future, what things will look like if the human race evolves as a society and embraces science and technology. With a very unique villain in Bowler Hat Guy and Doris, the aforementioned Bowler Hat. I think Meet the Robinsons might be a favorite of mine. It's been a while since I've rewatched it properly, but I do remember having a lot of fun with it the last few times I have watched it. And we'll wrap things up. The final film of the post-Renaissance era, Bolt. I think people either love Bolt or they hate Bolt. I tend to lean towards the former. I don't love it, but I do see what makes Disney great in Bolt in terms of the story, the heart, the characters, using famous voice actors like John Travolta and Miley Cyrus to enhance their characters. Bolt's a pretty safe, fun film. At the very least, if it helped Disney really hone its skills and get ready to fully embrace CGI for the revival era, it does its job perfectly fine. So those are the films of the post-Renaissance era. As you can see, very turbulent time, all over the place in terms of where it's going, what it wants to do, CG, 2D animation, science fiction adventures, 21st century humor, all the while DreamWorks and 20th Century Fox Animation is chasing them on their heels with much more critically successful animated films. But if for nothing else, this period helped Disney go, okay, here's what we're going to do moving forward. It shows when we eventually return, when I talk about the revival era, the critically successful and box office results of those films just showcase that Disney eventually regained its dominion peak of being basically the emperor of animation. Maybe it's the evil empire, who can say, but they're top of the ranks now after this turbulent time. There you are. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've enjoyed remembering the post-Renaissance films. Maybe one or two of them are your favorites. Maybe all of them are your favorites. Or maybe you despise every single one. That's to be expected. Feel free to let me know if any of these are your favorite or not. Doesn't matter. But otherwise, thank you for listening as always, and I'll be back next week with another episode that will be not so Disney focused. Maybe, we'll see. You've been spliced in later. Adios, muchachos. I'll catch you next time.